I want to start my talk by talking a little bit more about this critical theory, the modern version of which I think is not good for people, not good for society, and is actually what's lying behind people who are anti-Zionist, anti the existence of the state of Israel, and is turned into anti-Semitism. So our question is, how did all of this happen, and what can we do about it? So I've been speaking about this thing called critical theory. It's something I want all of you to really understand, because when you talk to someone from college, they've taken the required course in Marxism, they've heard about this, they come home as if it is 100% true, undoubtable. So I want you to know about it. So just a few words on that, and I'll warm up to an essential point. So again, I'll be repeating myself, but if you're brand new to this, it's worth repeating. So critical theory, remember, does not mean to criticize. It comes from, in modern use, the German word Kritik with a K. And critique means, here's my metaphor, to lift up the hood of something and see how it operates inside. So the most two famous examples of critique were written by Immanuel Kant, who lived at the end of the 1700s, early 1800s. And he wrote two books of critique that are almost impermeable. I've been told by German speakers, they read the books in English in order to understand the German. I've never read either book completely through in German. I read in English or German. I read the summaries of them. I try to get the essence of what Kant is saying. So let me give you, just briefly, what he means by critique. One is the critique of reasoning, or what he means by pure reasoning. By pure reasoning, it means he's not reasoning about something. For example, is this a mic? Is this a camera? So he would call that reasoning about the external world, which is not pure reasoning. Pure reasoning is something like math. And then if you go back to Aristotle, logic, and many other questions. So the question is, just inside the human mind, how do we reason? So he writes a critique, not being critical of pure reasoning, but wanting to understand what reasoning is. From what I understand, when I read the response to Kant, he's the person that goes beyond Aristotle, and I'll show you where. It is a foundational book in modern philosophy, and I'll show you why. The other critique he wrote was the critique of practical reasoning, which for him was morality. How do we judge morally? I won't talk about that right now, because I'm interested in what happens after Kant writes Critique of Pure Reasoning. He gives many categories of reasoning. It's really, if you read a summary of it, it's a brilliant book that shows all of the ways that the inner experience of humans in the world, and Kant says, you probably heard this term, categories of perception. So for example, just the basics, how we perceive time, length, distance, all these kinds of things that are inborn in the human being, otherwise we couldn't perceive them, which means the only way that I can perceive the outside world is that there are structures in my brain that already know how to deal with them. Now, this idea, and this is where we start to move toward critical theory, I'm going to say, and it's various dimensions. I'll call good critical theory and bad critical theory, and I'll share with you why. So the idea that we should study perception and not try to study what's really out there is a profound Kantian idea. It took out the whole problem of knowing what's out there. This is called the question of epistemology. How can I know what's out there when all we really know, according to Descartes, is I know that I'm thinking, therefore cogito ergo sum. I'm thinking, therefore I am. The question is, who's doing all this thinking here? Now, once we start with, well, I'm the one doing the thinking, so at least I know if there's somebody here doing the thinking, then the question is, okay, let's start here. Now, what can I know about the outside world, both the physical and metaphysical? I hope you're following me. This has been a big question, again, ever since the time of Plato and Aristotle, especially Aristotle, who tried to lay this out in a very, very organized way. The question of how we know. Now, that happens all the time. How do you know there's God? How do you know what's right and wrong? So these questions get asked, but only someone with a little bit of training in the theory of knowing or epistemology can get any traction in the question. It's something you should all know a little bit about. Question is, how do we know? How do I know what I'm feeling? Every person said, I don't know what I'm feeling. How do what somebody else is feeling? How do I know what I think? How do I know what you think? These questions, person says, I'm not sure what I think. I don't know what you're thinking. How could that person have been thinking that? Now, these are ways that we talk, but for a person trained a little bit in theory of knowing, that's actually a serious question. So, for example, one question of mine is, when I watch the demonstrators, when I watch the hatred of Israel, when I watch the acceptability of the idea of genocide, my question is, what do they know? What's going on in their heads that makes that permissible? What's going on inside of them where that seemed to be a good idea? So my question is, again, it's a deeper question, but I want to share it with you today. What do they know? I'm not saying it's true, but what is it that they know that permits them to say Israel should be destroyed, that the Jews should be killed? What do they know? It's some kind of knowledge. It's not accurate. It's not reasonable. It doesn't accord with anything true, but they think they know something, and that's what generates their opinions, their beliefs, and their advocacy. So that's why I'm teaching about our knowing what they, quote unquote, know, so that we can dismantle the knowledge that produces so much evil. I hope you're following me here. So this idea that we experience the world through categories of perception is foundational to Kant. So Kant said, let's not worry about knowing, understanding, meaning my eyes, as it were, perceive these magnifiers. Are there really magnifiers? How do I know there are really magnifiers? How can I escape my own, it's a philosophical question, how can I escape my own subjectivity and know what's really there? Well, I can feel it. How can you trust the sensation of touch? I can see it. Isn't the sensation of sight limited? So there's a big question in philosophy called the inside-outside dilemma. The fact that I experience something does not tell me actually what something is, because the world is perceived by our senses. So is my brain experiencing my perceptions or experiencing the outside world? Now, if this sounds a bit arcane to you, it is. Hardly any normal person asks that question unless you studied philosophy. So Kant says, let's not even worry about the magnifier. Forget about it. It is true that we don't experience the world, he called it an sich, as it actually is. We experience it through perception. That's true. Let's just talk about perception. This is Immanuel Kant. So Immanuel Kant prefers the term phenomenology, meaning a phenomenon is something that arrives in our senses. So he says, we're not going to get at the actual world beyond our senses because we can't. We can reason, we can understand our categories of perception, but we're not going to overcome them. This is Kant. So he creates the term phenomenology. Let's study let's study experience. Let's study perception, since we're never going to get beyond perception. All right, so when I was in graduate school, I had a lot of training in this idea of phenomenology, and it solved a very large number of philosophic and religious questions for me. Because people would say to me, what do I believe about God? Do I believe in God? For example, probably the most important question that phenomenology answered for me, which means the study of experience, the study of perception. So when someone talks about the nature of God, they have to go back to theology, meaning what does the Bible teach? What does Maimonides teach? What does Aquinas teach? What does Al-Farabi teach? Which means, what do the experts teach? In the Western religious tradition, they get their information from the Bible. The problem, as you know, the Bible is incoherent, doesn't cohere. So one were to say, these are the things we know about God from the Bible. Well, if you rely on the Bible, there's nothing reliable when you put the Bible together. As you know from Jack Miles' book, God, a Biography, there are many different perceptions of God in the Bible. That's the whole theme of his book. I believe he has 21 different personalities of God in the Bible. So I'm going to put the Bible aside. I mean, it's informative for me what those 20 different personalities of God. But one reason I reject theology as an enterprise is because theologians are usually organizing biblical beliefs clearly through their perceptive bias and producing it as if it's authoritative. I hope you're following this. I reject nearly all theology that claims to know God because it organizes in some way the incoherent theology of the Bible, try to systematize it, and then present it as true, when from my perspective, they've just systematized the beliefs of the Bible that don't cohere with each other. I just rather read the Bible myself. I'll give you an example. Our greatest theologian, Maimonides, I find him brilliant. I find him, especially his legal studies, brilliant. It means nothing to me religiously. In fact, whenever a person says, I'm going to study Jewish theology, I'm going to study Maimonides, I recommend don't. Because what they're studying is Maimonides, who's thoroughly a Platonic Aristotelian. That is his actually uber religion. That's the religion that he believes, by which he assesses all religion. He believes in Plato and Aristotle. Then he comes to the Bible and he says, the Bible must be interpreted according to Aristotle. The Muslim philosophers, Jewish philosophers such as Maimonides, and then, of course, Christian philosophers such as Thomas Aquinas. So it's a little bit hard for people to hear this sometimes, that Maimonides' deepest faith convictions are rooted in Aristotle. He brings that to the Bible. So when you study Maimonides, you're studying his understanding of the Bible through the lens of Aristotle. I'm not an Aristotelian, so it's significant because I'm a learned Jew. It's not significant for my faith. Now, I'm not saying I don't learn some things from the Guide for the Perplexed, but it does not shape my faith. So sometimes I've had people say to me, I'm going to study Jewish theology. I say, what are you studying? I'm going to take a course in Maimonides. I say, do you want my opinion? No. Okay. Yes. I say, I don't recommend you do because I don't think it's going to speak to your faith. And they say, how can you say that? He's our greatest philosopher. So I've now shared with you. Maimonides' perception of the Bible is rooted in a perception of reality that he took from Aristotle. So is Maimonides actually reading the Bible? Well, yes, but through the lens of Aristotle. So I just want you to think about this. Everything that we perceive in the world is through a lens. And so now the question of Kant is, let's study the lens. So when people say to me, what do I believe about God? I don't start with the Bible. Why? Because again, the Bible has many different ideas about God. And if someone were to say, what do you believe about God? I'll say, well, I pick number 3. Why do I pick number 3? Why not number 5? Clearly, there's something in my mind that says, pick number 3, not number 5. So now my question is, let me look at that. What in me, of these 20 different options of what God is like in the Bible, metaphoric number, but pretty close, why do I resonate with one and not the other? See, that's a deeper question for me. I hope you understand. The deeper question for me is the structure of my categories of perception through which all reality is filtered. The structure of my categories of perception through which all reality is filtered. That becomes what I consider to be the deepest philosophical question. Some ignore it. Again, it's part of my training since I was in college and graduate school. So then, what is there a limit to my categories of perception? The limit to my categories of perception, I'll just mention one, is American pragmatism, which means if my category of perception says that's not a chair, there's no chair in this room, and I walk across the room and bump my shins on the chair, well, reality has put a boundary around my categories of perception. So if I say, how'd I miss the chair? Well, I saw the chair, I thought it was a chair, but I have a belief system, something like law of attraction. Our beliefs create reality. So if I'm just going to unbelieve that there's a chair, and then I walk into the chair. I say, well, I actually can't do that. I can't just unbelieve reality. This is the American pragmatic response to Kant. Now, let's go to the question of God. You're probably interested in that, and then I'll take this to today. When people say to me, what do I believe about God? I would say, if you mean, do I have a set of propositions about God? Not really. Well, what does Judaism say about God? I said, that's a little bit important to me, but that's not that important to me. I love the Jewish tradition. I study it, but not for knowledge of God, because the Jewish tradition gives me so many options on the knowledge of God. I'm interested in knowing them, but I know that I've only chosen a couple. So my question isn't, can I teach you all the options about belief in God in the Jewish tradition? Yeah, I can. But I think it's more important if somebody says, what do I believe about God, to tell you that, and maybe to share with you how you can study the Jewish tradition to understand your categories of perception and how you understand the divine. Mine's not authoritative. What you come up with has to be the authority in your life. And the question is, what kind of belief in God produces the best kind of human being? This is one of my deepest questions. For example, if a person says, I heard someone say to me, a person got throat cancer because they didn't speak up enough. I think that's a bad belief. It might even be a wicked belief that somehow our physical diseases are rooted in some kind of metaphor. Like, I don't speak up enough, so that I get throat cancer. Someone actually said this to me. And I said, where'd you get this belief? And they told me some author who writes about that the way we conduct ourselves affects our body, and it's kind of a one-to-one. If I'm carrying too much in my life, I'll have shoulder pain. The person says, no, you have back pain or something else. So I don't think that's a good theology. There might be some connection between what we experience and the body, but not in a theological sense. It's my biggest critique of law of attraction, because people say, what I believe attracts things to me. I find that not only problematic, but in some ways morally disgusting, because I read about drive-by shootings, and I say, what, did they attract bullets? They didn't do anything wrong. And so if you believe in law of attraction, you have a lot to talk about, a lot to answer about of the evil that happens in the world. Do people attract evil? I just don't think so. So I do not include that in my theology. Now, so how do I use phenomenology, which means the study of experience, to answer a question about God? You probably know I don't say believe in God. I talk about my experience of the divine. So I have experiences, and when I look at my experiences, the only word that matches the experience is the divine. So for example, awe, the sense of an outside knowledge knowing me. People can say, well, you made that up. It's not true. It's what's called a psychologism. It's something internal that you're attributing to the outside. I say, okay, so that's what you think. From my inner experience, I'm experiencing something out of me. Now, if you're denying me that experience, it's a free country, you can say that, but I don't find that interesting in discussion, that someone can always come along and say, that which you experience does not exist. Okay, they can say that. I don't find it an interesting conversation. If someone said to me, for example, one person said, I was lying on the operating table and I felt myself go from my body and look down on the operating room. Okay, so this is many, many years ago. A person went to one rabbi. He said, that's impossible. See a psychologist. The person said to me, what do you think? I said, sounds possible. I don't think consciousness is limited to the, to the limits of the skull, to the skin on our head. I think consciousness can be projected. I can't prove it, but it seems likely to me. And so this person had to choose between a rabbi that said, go see a psychologist, and the rabbi who said consciousness can be projected. So you understand, from one rabbi's categories of perception, it's a psychological disorder. From another rabbi, this rabbi's categories of perception, that's entirely likely. Let's look at it. So when I think about the divine, I don't say to myself what I believe, although I do have some beliefs that come from experience. So my experience of the divine is, number one, as I've gone through life, a source of love, grace, and forgiveness. That's just my experience. So when I have felt overwhelming divine grace. It didn't feel like it came from inside. It feels like there's a force in the universe that funneled into me, that showered upon me divine love, divine grace, that came from, sometimes I say, an external source like this, and sometimes they say it bubbled up from a well within, that there's a wellspring inside of us where God's love and grace is trying to enter into us, and we are the ones who put debris on top of that inner fountain, and part of our spiritual work is to remove the debris. These are all also obviously metaphors. So those are ways that I experience God. I also experience the divine in times of deep reflection when I'm asking for moral qualities, that moral qualities of what I'll call being wise, being courageous, being forgiving, however we understand these words. I think these are noble qualities and therefore closer to the divine. Again, this is my belief system, a system based on my perception of myself, my experience, and something called the divine that flows into me that is not of my psychological creation. Now, of course, I can't prove it, but here's what's interesting. When I talk this way, some people say, that's ridiculous. There's no evidence for it. I say, okay, so don't believe it. Other people say, that's exactly what I experience. So now I have found, as it were, my spiritual kinfolk, right? That set of people who say, I don't get it from the Bible. I don't read the Bible and say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, because there's no consistent belief. I'll say, let me just start with, have I had experiences that my inner life will label, oh, the divine, God, the holy. Those are the words that match the experience. Then I start to try to reflect on and organize that experience. So the beginning of so-called critical theory in the modern sense is Kant, who tries to understand the inner workings of something, knowing that we perceive the world according to categories of knowledge. So we're going to call this the beginning of critical theory. Obviously not bad. I think powerful and relatively true. Now let's take the second step. I see I'm running out of time. What Marx, when he comes along and says, most of what we perceive about the world is incorrect. Because Marx says, yes, we have categories of knowledge. That's true. But there are two basic categories of knowledge. The category of the ruling elite, who then make up thought systems that justify their being the ruling elite, and the thought system of the oppressed, who make up thought systems that make them accept oppression. So Marx says we have basically two options, and you can't opt out because of your status in society. Meaning, are you the oppressor or the oppressed, ruling elite or the ruled? One of those two options, the way you perceive the world is according to your class. Oppressor, oppressed. Ruling elite, victim. Clearly, I've reduced Marx to something of a caricature, but I think is basically true. So now, what he says is that the Überbau, the above structure of our beliefs and ideologies, is rooted in the Unterbau, the understructure, which is our position in the structure of society. Now, Marx, remember from last week, sees himself as someone outside the system who can see this. When you think about that for a moment, Marx is the person who has secret knowledge. Secret meaning he's discovered it, other people don't see it, so he's like a prophet, but of the so-called Gnostic sense. I talked about this last week, and I want to really drill this home. Marxism is a kind of Gnosticism. By the way, I didn't make this up. If you want to read the great philosopher on this is Eric Voegelin, Voelin, I think. I wish I could spend the rest of my life studying Voegelin, but I can't. So I have summaries of his philosophy, but one of the major contributions he makes to the analysis of politics is that Marxism claims a knowledge about things and therefore claims to step outside the system. Hope you can all see that. So there's ruling class perception, oppressed perception. Each of their perceptions is justified by something going on underneath it that as it were, supports the belief system. One belief system says, I have the right to oppress the oppressed, and the oppressed say, I guess they have the right to oppress me. Okay, so it's as it were these perceptions are interiorized. Now, Marxism is also a normative vision. Now that he's created what I call a false reality, and it really is a false reality, that the world is built from two types, oppressor, oppressed. The normative vision is the ruling elite oppressors should be overthrown. This is part of his normative vision. And that the oppressed, as it were, deserve to run everything. He calls this the dictatorship of the proletariat. So it is a normative vision, which means it's about right and wrong. He has vision of the future, that the proletariat will overthrow, the workers will overthrow the state, the ruling elite, and there will be a dictatorship of the proletariat, and then the withering away of the state. Now when you read about this, it is absurd beyond imagination that he thinks this is true, but okay, there are absurd religious beliefs. The problem with this religious belief is they kill people over it. So I might believe one day there will be a Messiah who will bring freedom and justice to the world, but I'm not going to kill anybody over it. So now this is the way that I judge a category of belief. Okay? And this is a very American pragmatic way to see things. So I'm influenced both by Kant's categories of perception and the regulator of perception, which is pragmatism. I hope you can see they have to work in tandem. My question is the consequences of a belief or a perception of the world. So however I perceive the world, I have a pragmatic boundary, but I have a moral boundary, which means if my perception of the world licenses me to acts of violence against the innocent, I have to actually deconstruct and rid myself of that perception because it's a bad perception. Okay? And this is the power, again, the phenomenal power of understanding there's a moral world that stands above all our perceptions, all our faith systems, all our religions, all our ideologies. If an ideology teaches that we don't live under a moral law, I think that ideology is incorrect to the point of evil. So again, the beginning of critical theory is this absolutely correct idea that we see the world through categories of perception. That's exactly right. Marx comes along and says, oh, I've solved it. These are the categories of perception, oppressor, oppressed, and a normative vision. One's better than the other. World should be overthrown. That leads to unbelievable havoc in the communist regimes in Soviet Union, China, Cambodia, all other places. It usually results seemingly in oppression all the way to genocide. Now that for me is prima facie evidence there's something seriously wrong with this Marxian ideology view of the world. Okay, so I don't object to Kant's critical theory. I don't even object to the idea, and I think it's true, I can perceive the world through my social class. I think that's true. People say, I perceive the world because I'm white. I said, I'm not going to say it's not true, but I'd like to see exactly how that functioned, and I don't think I've done anything wrong from it. Most of the white people I know are very dedicated to civil rights of people who are not white. So I'm not exactly sure how my whiteness affects anything. In fact, I've said, I don't even refer to myself as white because I don't think there's something that we can homogeneously call white. So now, what about my Jewishness? Does my Jewishness create a perception of the world? I'm going to assume so. Remember, I'm born Jewish. My family joined a synagogue when I was 12, and I'm trying to look, how did my perception of the world change when my family began to go to synagogue? Well, one thing is, I felt I belonged to a people. Okay, now that's something happened to me. Then what happened next? Well, I created an inordinate care for the Jewish people once I found out that I was born into the Jewish people. Has it produced anything, a mistake about reality? I mean, when I see chairs, do I see chairs? And if I don't see a chair, will I bump into it? So I don't think my seeing the world through the lens of Jewishness has had me make any fundamental errors in the world. I think it's only increased my moral sensitivity, and that's part of what I mean by Jewish ethics is the Jewish way in the Jewish text to bring ethical and moral considerations to light. So remember, all ethics is about the moral law, but every tradition has a way to articulate the moral law. And I found that my studies of our tradition and so forth has made me a more ethically sensitive person. Now, I have to say, because I have training in moral philosophy in general, especially in the Greeks, etc., I think just about any study of ethics, if it's truly study of ethics, is going to raise your perception, raise your sensitivity to ethical considerations. So, so the last thing I want to say here is there's a lot of good in critical theory, meaning the idea that you perceive the world from many things. Yes, race. Yes, class. Yes, gender. But it's not inevitable. It's not what's called dispositive. Because I am a white male, I would say born working class, maybe now middle, upper class, I don't think my perception of the world has changed because I care about human beings. I want to ameliorate the human condition. Now, the problem, so by the way, if you want to read one person, what I call good critical theory, that says it doesn't produce the inevitable, which means I can examine all these things about me, and I can look at the world, and I can figure out, do my perceptions mistake the world? Do my perceptions lead to any kind of moral failure? Or when I look at the world, can my view of the world impel me to be objective, to be empathetic, to see the world from the perspective of other people, to ameliorate human suffering in a real sense? And so the best person to read, if you want to read about what I call the best of critical theory, is Habermas, Habermas. If there's one philosopher for you to study, I would say Habermas. There's a lot of background in Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics and Vogelin and so many other people. If you only have time for one for the rest of your life, study Habermas. Because Habermas broke with the critical school over exactly this. Is it orthodox, leading to one kind of activism that has one kind of goal, that oftentimes is hate and genocide? Or is it a tool to examine ourselves and society, to lift up the hood of society, and even lift up the hood of the self, and gain some kind of knowledge? But Habermas has a very clear moral vision that doesn't include hating people because they're Jewish or not, a Zionist or not, Israeli or not, white or not. He has what I would call the best version of critical theory. By the way, he's still alive. He's a very, very old man. He's in his 90s, if I'm not mistaken. Habermas broke with critical theory on exactly this point, to the point that he says he's a social theorist, because critical theory has become tainted by this idea that the world is divided into oppressor and oppressed. So I wanted to give you a more full understanding of critique based in Kant, how much critique has shaped my experience of God, not faith in God, but experience of God. How this idea of critique, as I was taught in graduate school, helps me understand society, societal structures. How this idea of critique, from Habermas's point of view, is even applied to the inner life. Psychotherapy, for him, is a kind of critique, meaning how does my psyche work and how can I make it work better? Psychotherapy literally means the therapy of the psyche, the therapy of the soul. He's my favorite philosopher to read, among many, many, many. And it's from Habermas, because I think he really taught me to be a social scientist, I can look at what's happening on campus, and I can critique what they're doing. I want to understand their inner lives. What would make them arrive at these conclusions that are so filled with genocidal hatred? I get these skills from the social scientist Jürgen Habermas. And as I said last time, I think there's a few things. One is the allure of mass movements. Mass movements have enemies. The Gnosticism of Marx. I've shared all of this with you. But today I wanted to lift the hood a little bit on this thing called critical theory. It's not all bad. Habermas is great. It's gone bad. Now, I haven't decided all this time to say good critical theory and bad critical theory. I just want to lump it in that most modern critical theory is untrue to evil. Now, today, I've decided add a little bit of sophistication to this. There's a basic truth to the idea that we do experience our life according to categories of perception, but Habermas thinks There's another category of perception, which is the corrective category of perception, that I can look at how I see the world, I can look at how I see myself, have some moral vision in mind, and correct myself to overcome categories of perception to some kind of moral vision. So it won't surprise you that many people have accused Habermas of becoming an American-style pragmatist. He says, yes, I test my categories of perception according to pragmatism. Does it accurately describe reality? That's one good pragmatic question. And another pragmatic question, is it moral? And so I think as as the college kids arrive home and they say critical theory, I want you do a little bit of reading and say, well, what about Habermas? Let's take a look at Habermas. You throw the word out Habermas, they're going to be, wow, you know about Habermas? Yeah, do you? No, I've heard of him, but we don't study Habermas. So the idea, yes, we have categories of perception. Race, gender, class has an influence, not an absolute influence. The most important thing is the will to see reality as it is and not according to ideologies, and the will to see ourselves and society as phenomena that are subject to willful moral transformation. All right, that's my whole talk for this morning.